slow. Well, they came down very hard, but then the enforcement's tough, right? Yeah.
So, yeah, very nice to have you, Steven, and people will keep connecting, and we are also on live stream. Not now, maybe in another 5-10 minutes, the moment it starts. Right now, Indian time is 12:24 or something, so another 5-6 minutes. So we'll get started in about 10 minutes by the Twitter. Right? And we'll be on live stream in both YouTube as well as in the social media.
Very good.
Okay, so nice of you to have in our platform. Thank you, Dr. Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, just come back a little bit. The rain has come back.
Yeah, Dr. Steve, I'll just introduce this, our director, Mr. Sarosh Kumar, has also joined. Sir, hope you are there. Hello. Dr. Steve, you are there?
I'm here. Yes.
Okay.
I'm on.
Yeah,
Good
yeah.
afternoon, Dr. Steven. It's nice to see you here.
Nice. Thank you so much. Good to be with you today.
Yeah.
In fact, Steven, we would have liked you to come to our campus. It is one of the wonderful campus here. But for the fact that, we are all in the pandemic and, unable to move about, we need to connect virtually. That's the situation.
Indeed.
But when I met you in Dhaka, the way you were, articulating, I was highly impressed with the Bangladesh Institute of Bank Management when we were, alongside speaking. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a nice program. I enjoyed that. It was a great group of people.
Okay. I think, they keep calling for something or other, and I guess they're also planning a lot more programs, all virtual, of course. So. Okay, then now I think we can get started. Since we are on live stream, many will be watching the live stream also, and we'll get started for today's program. So, welcome all participants, and today we are on the D-Day, or what we call the Foundation Day. And all the other 2 days we were having a lot of sessions which are leading up to the Foundation Day, and today is the 23rd of September 2020, the Foundation Day of State Bank Institute of Leadership. And this particular institute came into being just in 2017 on this very same day, having been inaugurated by our chairman, the then Arundhati Bhattacharya Madam, and that's how this particular Foundation Day is getting celebrated, and we are stepping our stones into the 4th year of after the inauguration. So much as of course, compared to the bigger institutes and the larger universities, we have made only baby steps, and we have a long way to go, but well begun is half done, and that is why we are here, celebrating each year the way we have moved about. And as we all know that the whole way the State Bank Institute of Leadership is envisaged is very different, and our director, Dr. Sarosh, will go about telling what was the vision of starting this institute and how we want to become a premier BFSI institution in India and perhaps.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Doctor. Am I audible?
I don't hear.
Mr. Kishan Kumar, you are not audible.
I'm audible, I guess.
Acha. Yes, sir, you are audible. Am I audible now? Yes, sir.
Dr. Steve,
mute their mic so that I think it would be audible.
Okay. Shall I tell all the participants to mute their mics, please, and also the audio, so that we will have a better viewing experience? And I just want to confirm with Dr. Steve that are we audible now?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we are hear you, sir. Okay. So now I invite our director, Mr. Sarosh Kumar, to give an inaugural address for this particular event. Over to you, Mr. Sarosh Kumar.
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Steven. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a really, what should I say? This is not only it's a privilege to you be with us. And this is a very emotional moment, or very empowering moment so far the institute is concerned. Today is our 4th Foundation Day. And when we are interacting with Mr. Dean, he thought you are one of the best speaker, and considering your profile, we felt that would be privileged to have you here and to have your discussion or deliberation, so that there would be lot many takeaways. At the same time, considering the occasion, your presence would match. So with this background, we have thought of it and ultimately you have come to us. Thank you very much from core of our hearts, from the team SBIL from Kolkata, India. Basically, this is a premier institute of leadership. State Bank of India, as you know, is a big conglomerate, and now it has thought of designing an institute and thinking beyond certain boundaries. Here, it's not a typical training institute. Here, it's a research institute. It is connecting with a lot many areas. And here, the thing of the basic idea is to groom the top and senior functionaries in the BFSI sector. But it is not confined to SBI. Because of that, the Dhaka, Bhutan, or some other Nepal, Karma. So we have spread across the globe in order to exercise this initiative or the motto of this institute. Apart from that, bringing academic excellence and reputation in all apex training institutes, that is also another forefront so far as this premier institute is concerned. How about this present pandemic? It has given a different dimension altogether. It has created a 360-degree approach. We have not only confined to BFI sector, we have tried to meet and connect with a relevant issue and eminent people. Because of that, you are here. So we have gone for a 360-degree approach. Accordingly, if you see, there is 3 days of this program was there, and there's so many eminent people from our education policy, from the COVID and leadership. Every area we have touched upon. Now you are going to share with the global economic challenges of the present context, and who can be best and better than you. So here, basically, as a normal person and whatever the things we are having now, the mindset is such that only the pandemic, only the COVID, it is taking toll of this. Because when this GDP is now for this quarter has gone for minus 28%, minus 28.9% of India. So you can think of the situation, what is the mindset of others, whether how much it is going to stress. So not many things which you are going to deliberate, it is going to be taken further. But while taking it further, we always feel that he who cannot be a good follower cannot be a good leader. So SBIL is thinking we must follow the top guns from the market and the different areas, domain specific, so that we can carry it forward and we can make it relevant. As far as the 2 great challenges before pandemic was there, one is the battle against poverty, and second is management of climate change. But having said this, whether the pandemic has again gone for any dimension, all these things definitely, when your deliberation will take place, it is going to come into fore. But what we shared is your presence is going to make a difference, and I'll tell you, this is going to have a very empowering moment so far as the SBIL is concerned. Thank you, Dr. Kishore Kumar, to bring this erudite and eminent speaker with us, and it would be a great privilege to have them on board. Thank you, Dr. Stephen. All the best. And another thing, this is a request and formal invitation to you. Whenever you will be in India, and from our side, being a director from team as well, there is a request for you to visit and see whatever the seed you have seen. We are going to magnify and you can showcase you. And it will be a privilege for you. It would be a privilege for us to showcase the best possible design, everything for our SBI. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Krishna.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sarosh Kumar, for the wonderful inaugural address, welcoming our chief guest of the day, Dr. Stephen Cochrane. As we all know, Stephen Cochrane heads the Apex, chief economist of the APEC region for Moody's Analytics, and Moody's Analytics and Moody's Ratings are 2 different entities. And but the moment you talk about Moody's, you know that they are into rating and into rating of not only corporates and so on. They also rate sovereigns, meaning the governments also. So much is the breadth of talent they bring in, and when we are talking about global economic challenges of the present context, who better than them who can showcase it? And I have already seen him, the way he deliberates with a larger audience, and I have no doubt on my mind that the people who are tuned in today will be highly benefited from his interactions. So, with that small introduction, I thought I'll give the profile of Dr. Stephen before I hand over the mic to him to be on in this particular event. Stephen G. Kocherin is a PhD and is a chief APAC economist in Moody's Analytics. He leads the Asia Economic Analysis and Forecasting activities of Moody's Analytics research team, as well as he has got a continual expansion of companies' international, national, and subnational forecast models. In addition, Steve is also directs consulting projects for clients to help them understand and affect regional economic developments on their business under baseline forecasts and alternative scenarios. And Steve's expertise lies in providing clear insights into areas of region strength, weaknesses, comparative advantages relative to macro and global economic trends. A highly rated speaker, Dr. Kocherin, has provided economic insights at hundreds of engagements over the past 20 years, and he has been featured in CNBC, CNA, Bloomberg, Wall Street Radio, and so on. Though his research and presentations, through his research and presentation, he in fact dissects various components of the macro and regional economies, shaping patterns of growth. His extensive expertise in US and global economic issues makes him also a very popular speaker to clients in conferences and executive briefings. It is in one such meeting that I met him in Dhaka for the Bangladesh Institute of Bank Management, wherein I could interface with him. And Steve also holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is a Penn Institute for Urban Research Scholar. He holds a master's degree from the University of Colorado, Denver, and has a bachelor's degree from the University of California at Davis. Dr. Kocherin is based out of Moody's Analytics Singapore office, and he heads the APAC region, as I said earlier. So with this wonderful profile Stephen has got, it's wonderful to have him here, and I'm sure that they were also having prior relationship with some SBI, because SBI he's into our Bombay office has interfaced with him, and many of his officials that also I could meet in Dhaka. So over to you, Dr. Stephen, and please get going. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for those very kind words. Let me just double check and make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we are able to hear you.
Very good. So it is indeed, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of your Founders Day events today, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some good context that can be used through the course of the conversation over the next several days. So let me take a moment here. Let me share my screen, and I'll pull up. If I understand how to do this, very good. Share, and I'll pull my screen around. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the title of my presentation is Economic Outlook, the Challenges Ahead. Again, there are so many challenges right now, challenges that we never thought we would be facing even 6 months ago. So a lot of what I will be talking about today is how, in a sense, we have had to change our thinking about the economy, and also about how to think about how to forecast economic activity, because the events today are like no other that we've experienced in our lifetimes in terms of the impacts of COVID-19. So I will talk first, provide some information on where I think the economy is today and where it's going from a global point of view. And then we'll bring it down a little more locally to India, and do a little bit of back and forth of talking about the Indian economy in the context of the of global economic conditions, since particularly in the context of COVID-19, no country operates independently right now. The whole the whole globe is linked up in this struggle to get ahead of COVID-19. So let me move on to the next chart and give you a glimpse of our global economic forecast and the timing that we expect in terms of how quickly much of the global economy will be able to get back on its feet. We divide the timeline into 4 periods, and I've got them labeled here as recession, reopenings, pandemic recovery, and post-pandemic recovery. It all began, of course, back in January, February, when COVID-19 became evident in China and then began spreading around the world, and governments began locking down, including India, which had one of the longest and strictest lockdowns around the world. And that caused the very, very deep, but very short, brief global recession that extended into the second quarter, and depending on where one is in the world, March, April, May, June, depending on where you are. Globally, it looks like the trough of the recession was in April. Subsequent months through mid-year was a pretty quick turnaround, this reopening period, as governments around the world then began reopening their economies, still maintaining social distancing regulations, but allowing firms to open up, both large firms, manufacturing firms, and some service-based firms. So the supply side began opening up first, largely as manufacturers began producing again. Slowly, the demand side began to pick up, although very slowly, because households and consumers have been very restricted in what they can do in many parts of the world. We are now in this period that we are calling pandemic recovery. In other words, the pandemic is still with us. In fact, in parts of the world, it is still spreading. In Europe, it seems to be rising again. In North America, we're seeing new cases, the number of new cases rise again. India, thankfully, seems to be off of its peak number of new cases, and the pandemic in India seems to be slowing. It's a very, very, very good sign. And much of the Asia-Pacific region, the pandemic is now at actually a fairly low level, although governments are still managing social distancing very, very carefully. So this is a period where actually we expect that this initial turnaround will slow. It will slow because we're still in the pandemic. There's no solution to the pandemic. In other words, there's no vaccine available yet. And so business leaders, business decision makers are still cautious. Consumers are still cautious. Consumer saving rates are still very high around the world. And the economic growth is at a very modest pace, but at least it is positive. There's still recovery. One of the most important assumptions about our forecast, and this is part of how we have to think differently about the economy, we have to take into account these epidemiological assumptions to think about economic growth. We are assuming that by the second quarter of 2021, there will be a vaccine available in many parts of the world, which, if it doesn't completely eradicate COVID-19, at least it may bring back some confidence among businesses so that investment spending accelerates amongst consumers, so that consumer spending accelerates, and particularly allows travel, tourism, and so forth to accelerate once again, that individuals won't be so hesitant to jump on an airplane and spend a few number of hours with many, many passengers on an airplane. So we expect that the pace of economic growth in the second half of 2021, next year, will finally accelerate once there is a vaccine. And if this is indeed the case, then the global economy, as measured by real GDP, gets back to its pre-pandemic peak sometime in the late third quarter or fourth quarter of 2021. So that's about how long it may take based on our baseline scenario. Of course, it's very uncertain. We don't know when a vaccine will truly be available. And we don't really know if there will be a broad second wave of COVID-19 that perhaps sweeps over at least the northern hemispheres in Europe and North America and such, and causes perhaps additional shutdowns. My assumption is that governments now and policymakers now, one, are hesitant to shut down economies for a second round, although we are seeing, for example, in Israel right now, they've got a second round shutdown now. But also governments and policymakers are much more aware of what it takes to stop a new cluster of COVID-19. And the assumption is that new clusters can be managed and contained through the processes of testing and contact tracing and quarantining. So that's a fundamental assumption to our baseline forecast. Of course, if we're wrong there, then the turnaround could be that much slower. But truly, much of the global economy actually has emerged from that short but very, very deep recession. This map illustrates the countries in blue are those that we estimate have begun the recovery process. Not that the economies are growing strongly or that the economies are back to where they were, but that they are in that recovery process. So you can see in North America, much of Europe, much of Asia, including India, that we are estimating based on current data that the economy is beginning to recover. One of the interesting patterns of economic recovery around the globe today is that the stability or initial recovery of the economy is being led by the goods producing sectors around the world, by manufacturing and large-scale industries in many parts of the world. This chart shows this a little bit. This is the blue line represents merchandise trade, so global trade, and the green line represents industrial production, global industrial production. This data is an aggregation of data around the world from CPB World Trade Monitor in the Netherlands. The data is a little bit lagged because it takes a long time to aggregate the data. It ends in June right now. And you can see that on a year-to-year percent change basis, that the downturn in the goods producing side of the economy actually is about as deep as it was back during the global financial crisis in 2009, close to a 20% year-to-year decline, both back in 2009 and this year in 2020. The difference, however, is that the goods-producing side of the economy in 2009 came back more of in a U-shape. There was quite several quarters before the turnaround began. But you can see in 2020, the turnaround has begun very, very quickly and very, very sharply. This is partly because many governments work very quickly to support a large-scale industry to get them back back operationally and running, particularly in China. The Chinese government worked very hard to provide funding for large companies, particularly to keep the export base of that economy going. And there was demand for certain kinds of goods, electronic products, because of the need for computer systems, improving computer systems, and laptop computers that were needed for working from home and for schools working remotely, and so forth as well. Also, the production of pharmaceutical goods has been very, very strong lately, given the needs with COVID-19 and such. So what is interesting is in normal recessions, usually the service producing side of the economy is the most stable, and manufacturing takes a long time to turn around, usually because it fell because of weak demand. Well, it wasn't weak demand that caused the downturn this time. It was simply the government shutdowns that shut down the manufacturing side of the economy. So that is what's leading the economy right now. It's one reason why China actually is doing very, very well, because of its huge export base. And actually, it is helping the Indian economy turn around as well. So this is data specific for India through July. And this is data for, again, measured on a percent change year-ago basis. Industrial production is the blue line in this case, and exports is the green line. And the turnaround, again, this was a pretty sharp decline, 60% decline in this case. And the turnaround we haven't got a level back up to where we were prior to COVID-19, but the improvement has happened very, very quickly in India, as it has in a number of countries in the Asia and Asia Pacific region. So I think India will be following the pattern of other countries of having its manufacturing economy come back first, and the service side of the economy related to household demand and related to any kinds of services that require person-to-person communication or proximity will be much slower to turn around. But this is at least a positive sign that recovery is indeed in the beginning stages anyway for India. It was mentioned in the introduction how badly the Indian economy was hit, and indeed, this is my calculation of the depth of decline of GDP, gross domestic product, country by country in the Asia Pacific area, measuring it as from 2019 Q4 to 2020 Q2. So I'm using a 2-quarter percent change basis. Now in India, the recession actually started later. Q1 had positive growth, whereas most of these other countries, the decline began in the first quarter of calendar year 2020. But just to have a common measure across areas, I measure this as the 2-quarter percent change from fourth quarter last year to second quarter of this year. And with this measure, it's roughly 26% decline in India, the deepest decline of any country, any major country around the world, due to the severity, the strictness, and the length of the shutdown across all of the Indian economy. You can see that the Philippines and Malaysia were somewhat similar. In fact, the Philippines had almost a very similar length and strictness in terms of its lockdown, and the economy was hit very, very hard by that. Malaysia and Singapore follow. The one thing that has helped buoy the Malaysian and Singapore economies is a very, very rapid response from the government in terms of a fiscal response and spending and trying to help support the economy. On the other hand, at the bottom of this chart, you can see China. Actually, China is positive because only Q1 had a quarter-to-quarter decline in GDP. Q2 was a positive rebound. Of course, China was first in and first out of the COVID-19 situation. And then Taiwan, Vietnam, Korea, to a certain extent, Hong Kong, did fairly well for two reasons. One is that they were all fairly adept at managing the COVID-19 pandemic. They were very early and had some of either the equipment and technology to manage testing and tracing, or simply had, in a sense, the political will to shut down neighborhoods very quickly when COVID-19 was traced. That's particularly Vietnam took sort of this low-tech approach, whereas Taiwan, Korea, a little more high-tech in terms of being very ready, as they had experienced SARS back a number of years ago, ready to test a large number of the population. Also, these economies are closely tied to the China economy. So when China began to turn around, there was a link through exports to China within Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, and of course, Hong Kong with its direct linkages to the Chinese economy. It is quite remarkable. Every time I look at this chart, I'm amazed at the wide array of differences in terms of the economic impact. And it illustrates how many different ways that governments respond to COVID-19 and how unprepared the global economy was. Although I think now, as I mentioned, I think policymakers are much better aware of how to control the pandemic. Not only did India have this hard hit from COVID-19, but the economy actually had been weakening, as I'm sure you know, leading up to COVID-19 as well. This is GDP by expenditure components. This is on a year-to-year percent change measure. The green line is total GDP, and then the bars break up the different components of GDP. And you can see that through 2018, 2019, there was a gradual slowdown in the economy. And indeed, investment spending was one of the weaknesses beginning in the second half of 2019, leading into early 2020. And then, of course, a huge drop not only in investment spending, but in consumer spending, offset only partially by government expenditures and a bit of that bit of an improvement in Q2 in exports. So India faced the downturn from COVID-19 because of the closure, but the momentum of the Indian economy had been slowing as well, which I think simply adds to the difficulties in terms of pulling the economy around in India and getting it back on its feet. Although, as I mentioned, at least from the goods producing side, things seem to be improving. I mentioned one of the key factors in terms of differentiating economic performance was not only the severity of shutdowns around the world, but also how much fiscal support has been provided by governments in terms of providing direct support to small and medium-sized enterprises, providing direct support to industries that are directly impacted by COVID-19, like travel, tourism, entertainment, other kinds of services. And this chart shows the levels of fiscal support. This was as of August. This is the extra fiscal support as a share of GDP. And you can see that many countries, Australia, US, Japan, Germany, Canada, have been very, very active very early in providing fiscal support. India was slower. I think this is one reason why the Indian economy also got hit so hard, is that the fiscal support for households and for industries, enterprises, was fairly modest early on. Now, I understand there has been some additional support since this data was pulled together. And my expectation is that nearly all of these countries will find themselves in need of providing additional spending to support the economy. Perhaps at least through the end of this year, maybe into the first quarter of next year, until we get to the point where there is more certainty about the future outlook based on a vaccine, or at least a very effective and widely accepted treatment protocol for COVID-19. So this is another important assumption in our forecasting, is that governments around the world, regardless of fiscal situation, regardless of levels of debt, will very likely continue to spend and support. And then the real question is whether the spending will be very effective in terms of directing that spending directly to those who need it, to households who are unemployed or have had their incomes cut, to small and medium-sized enterprises who need the support until demand turns around for their goods and services. This will be a really key factor to be watching around the globe in terms of not only the size of spending, but also the effective nature of spending to get that fiscal support where it is needed. Not only fiscal spending, but monetary policy has responded as well, including in India, where interest rates have been brought down. This is the monetary policy rate for the central banks, and just a selection of central banks around the region. The RBI has cut the policy rate is down to about 4% now. And actually, in a few places, such as in India or Indonesia, there could well be some potential for further monetary policy easing. Although, frankly, my feeling is that the heavy lifting in terms of supporting economies going forward will really be done by direct spending through fiscal policy, that is the fastest and most direct way to put a floor under the economy and support small enterprises so that they survive this period and are able to grow once the economy begins to expand once again. And in fact, one of the issues in India that might make it difficult for further easing in terms of monetary policy is that it's one of the few countries where there is a measurable amount of inflation. As of July, anyway, the CPI was up by over 5% over prior year. The highest in the region, Vietnam, was next at about 3%. A number of countries in the Asia Pacific region either have seen their CPI decline over the year, or very, very close to zero. And so there is room for central banks, given the low inflation and the fact that the Federal Reserve in the US, along with the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, have signaled that interest rates will be very low for a long time in those parts of the world as well. So if inflation can ease up further, and this will probably happen again once the economy gets back on its feet and production bottlenecks, not only for manufactured goods but for food supplies as well. Once the economy starts operating a little more more rapidly, we may see some improvement in inflation in India. But so far, we haven't seen that happen yet. So obviously, India has a deep hole to pull out of it, given how far down the economy went in the second quarter. I show this chart to illustrate the levels of uncertainty that we have about the outlook for the economy. We have our baseline forecast. The baseline forecast is the blue line. This is our 50% probability forecast for GDP growth. And the way I'm measuring GDP growth here is the percent change from the start of the recession. So in this case, it's the percent change from the first quarter of 2020, which was the last, that was the previous peak of GDP in India. And our baseline forecast shows a return to peak by sometime early to mid 2022. But to show you how uncertain it is, I show our downside scenarios, which we produce every month along with our baseline scenario for countries around the world. And the S3 is a 10% probability. The S4 is a 4% probability downside scenarios. Those are the light blue and the purple lines on this chart. And you can see that, frankly, it wouldn't take a lot for the recovery to be delayed by about a year till early 2023 or even the end of 2023, particularly if some of our assumptions prove to be wrong. And some of those assumptions that are critical, one is that there will not be a sustained second wave of COVID-19 around the world, and particularly in the developed economies around the world. Second is that governments don't have the willingness to provide that fiscal support that I mentioned, I think will be very important over the next 3 to 6 months. It could be very difficult for some countries who have difficulty entering into the debt markets and finding the funds they may need to provide any added fiscal support. There's some risk that debt payment holidays, the forgiveness of not paying off, not making payments on loans could end too soon. A number of countries around the world have debt payment holiday measures in place, and likely they may well be extended into first quarter next year, perhaps even longer. If those are not maintained or extended, that could cause some weakness in the economy in 2021, at least. Another factor that could cause the downside to become more of a reality would simply be that global trade and the manufacturing side of the economy doesn't maintain its current pace. So, for example, a lot of the demand for manufactured goods is coming from industries that are rebuilding inventories and, in fact, stockpiling inventories to protect themselves against a potential a period of economic shutdown again if there is a second wave of COVID-19. So there could be some extraordinary building up of inventories, which means that the manufacturing side of the economy might naturally slow more than we would expect as we get into 2021, once those inventories are built up to a sufficient and comfortable level. And finally, maybe perhaps the biggest unknown in terms of the outlook is when a vaccine will truly be available. I mean, there are huge efforts going on in India, in North America, in China, in Europe to develop vaccines. I guess one of the best things is that there are many tracks going in terms of the research and testing for vaccines. But we don't really know when one will be available. Also, we don't know what that vaccine might look like, whether one shot will work or whether it takes a shot and then a subsequent booster shot. We don't know how widely a vaccine can be distributed around the world. There are efforts to make sure there are multilateral efforts going on to make sure of a global distribution of a vaccine. But until that happens, we don't really know. And you can see that the downside scenarios, the spread between our baseline forecast and our downside scenarios are much greater than the spread between the baseline and the upside scenario, even though the probability assumptions for the two upsides, the green and the red, are symmetric to the two downside, the S3 and the S4. So I'm optimistic. I think if all goes well, the recovery will continue, as I mentioned, first at a slow pace through the end of this year into next year. And then as we get into the middle of 2021, we may see some of the previous vitality of the global economy finally return. So I will leave it right there and turn it back to whoever will be a moderator here. And if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to entertain any questions that
Thank you.
might be.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stephen. In fact, we have been getting questions over here and earlier during the registration phase also. And thank you for wonderfully explaining the outlook, economic outlook of the world, and how, as you correctly said, the downside scenarios and the upside scenarios are getting worked out with so much of impinging factor on the vaccine and so on. There has always been some questions on. We also talked about the fiscal and monetary measures by various countries. In fact, India also was one such country which has gone for loan repayment holidays and things like that. What we call here as a moratorium. In fact, it has come to an end by sometime in August and August 31st, and then right now it is still there, but it is on a case-to-case basis. It is not on a broad brush basis. So that's the change that has happened. And there is, we always say that the traders, or what we call the MSMEs, have availed of it to the level of about 70 to 80% of the book, the banking book in India, whereas the retail people haven't gone for it to that much extent. Maybe only 20% have availed that benefited, 80% have not gone for that particular benefit. Because Supreme Court which is still working on, how to go about it, and there is an interest on interest scenario which has been flagged, and now I just want to know from if you factor in other countries many of these kind of repayment holidays. One question asked that how is the scenario in other countries? So much as the book is under repayment holiday, or only a few percentages is that availed it?
So the scenarios around the world are fairly similar, partly because the approaches to policy are fairly similar, different degrees, of course, as my charts showed, but fairly similar around the world. And what we are trying to do is factor in country by country when for example, when the debt payment holidays come to an end, or when we expect that extraordinary fiscal policy will come to an end. When that happens, that does factor into the forecast and pull down GDP growth temporarily by, depending on how fast the country is going, perhaps 50 basis points or so, something like that. I mean, that's just a broad number across countries. But it is the point where the risks are the greatest, because that's where, and I don't want to be alarmist, but that's where you reach a certain cliff, if you will, a point where NPLs may begin rising in banks, or those NPLs at least have to become recognized, and then banks have to begin provisioning for those NPLs, and then there may be a hesitancy amongst banks to lend. So there could be a little bit of a tightening in terms of supply of credit in economies. That's the risk that every country will face at because ultimately at some point these debt payment holidays must come to an end, and then ultimately when the extraordinary fiscal spending comes to an end, we factor in largely into consumer spending because so much of the fiscal support goes directly to households. And in fact, we had to do that for the United States, our forecast for the U.S., because we thought that there would be some extension of some of the extraordinary payments going to the unemployed in the U.S. It's not happening now, and we're already seeing in amongst some very high frequency data anyway that consumer spending seems to be slowing in the U.S. So you can see it happens very, very quickly. It's not going to take time at all when one gets to the end of these different kinds of policy responses. So this is where forecasting becomes so difficult because so much of it depends on policy as opposed to basic supply and demand in different industries at this point in time.
Very good, very good. Good to know, sir. One more question. It talks about, we always talk about the decoupling effect ever since, the trade war happened and countries started decoupling their value chains and supply chains away from China and so on. And much of it is supposed to have happened before even the pandemic struck, as you worded it. The pandemic recovery and the post-pandemic recovery may not have anything to do with that. It has started a phenomenon that has started much earlier to that.
Yep.
But has COVID fast-tracked it, and did you notice any kind of value chain or supply chain change driven decoupling effect in the Southeast Asian region or South Asia in general?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's actually on the top of everybody's minds. I get this question every time I speak with a client, so this is quite timely. One of the sort of from a broad sense, what seems to the primary factor that COVID-19 has played in the economy is that it has accelerated many changes that were happening in the economy prior to COVID-19 happening. So digitization, more delivery of consumer products, like e-trade, the use of electronics like we're using today for this meeting. I mean, we wouldn't have thought of doing it this way 6 months ago, and not that I don't know if it's accelerated the decoupling, only because it's a very complex issue, but it has certainly focused everyone's eyes on the topic. And I think one can safely say that the decoupling has begun, and it probably will continue given where policies are going and the differences between the United States and China right now in their policies. In terms of seeing things happen, as I said, things are moving slowly, but Vietnam is probably a very, very good example. Vietnam was one country that has grown very, very quickly over the past 3, 4, 5 years, and to a large degree because they've been able to attract investment that might have gone to China before. They're very close to China, so the distances aren't great, and they have an eager and fairly skilled labor force. They still need to skill up, but fairly skilled anyway. What happened in Vietnam was that during the first quarter, foreign direct investment plummeted in Vietnam. It practically went to zero. Of course, the whole global economy froze in the first quarter, right? Because nobody knew what was happening. But it was remarkable how quickly that FDI came back in the second quarter from Korea, from Japan, from Singapore. These were some of the sources of FDI in Vietnam very, very quickly. So clearly there was an interest in maintaining the growth of these supply chains that they had been working on previous to COVID-19 and expanding them even further. And what it does, it makes it clear in my mind that there's in managing supply chains, of course, industries are looking at geopolitical risk, we're looking at labor market risk in terms of rising labor costs around the world and such. And now, of course, there's a public health or pandemic risk, which wasn't part of the equation before. And I think if nothing else, this will work to expand the decoupling, if nothing else, by following what's become known as a China plus one strategy. That firms that are firmly in the China economy, linked through with the supply chains there, probably aren't going to leave because the China economy is just too big to abandon, and it's growing quickly. But it's not good enough to have all your eggs in one basket. You need to have some of your supply chain either in Southeast Asia or in India or in Mexico, or someplace either close to your markets or at least in a place that has proven to be a good manager of the pandemic. And this is the last 6 months have shown us how the differences in the way governments react and manage uncertainty like the pandemic. And I think these will be factors that industries take into consideration when they're looking at locations for supply chain management.
True. And is there stagflation is a reality now, the real risk that we need to factor in the scheme of things, at least in some of these countries?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that.
No, is there a stagflation worry also?
Is there a stagflation worry? Well, not in the near term. I can tell you, we do a weekly survey of our clients around the world, and we ask them about business conditions and whether they're hiring or investing or raising prices. And it is amazing that the number of respondents who respond that they are raising prices, it's practically zero. Like nobody seems to have any pricing power right now at all, except maybe some of the high-tech firms that really are highly concentrated in their industries. So I don't think it's an issue for today. Now, the longer that interest rates stay as low as they are, and if central banks don't time any kind of normalization of interest rates properly, I think there's a risk going forward, 2022, 2023 maybe, that stagflation could become a reality. And in fact, that is part of our downside scenarios, is to factor in higher inflation and slower growth. But for now, I don't think it's too much of a risk. The real need is simply to get these economies going again, no matter what it takes. That's really the priority at the moment.
Okay. And we have a research team also. There's a question from one of our researchers. What is your take on whether the developing countries will recover faster or the developed countries, and whether the probable obstacles either will it be more on the supply side factor or on the demand side factor, or policies for the faster for the faster recovery of nations? Yeah.
Well, I think certainly the developed economies have the advantage of having more fiscal space, if you will, to be able to manage the demand side. The supply side is coming back, and the fiscal spending will help manage the demand side. So developed economies certainly have that advantage going forward. I think what emerging markets need to be focusing on is making sure that the industries that are linked to global supply chains and into the parts of the global economy that are expanding, the good side of the economy, are truly able to do that in terms of having the labor on hand and the financing available to make sure that they can remain liquid and keep operations going and stay connected with the global economy. I think that's key.
Okay. There is a question from one of our senior bank executives. He's asking, India, as you know, has got a lot of informal sector, and incidentally, the informal sector is the one which has been affected much more than the formal sector, and we really don't know how they're going to claw back unless the things recover. And have you cited any kind of evidences of recovery in the informal sector, especially in countries like India?
Yeah, I wish I had good data for you or good information on how the informal sector is doing. I don't have anything other than perhaps the same anecdotes that you may be reading as well. I do think that, of course, I think that is one of the difficulties that India and much of South Asia faces right now is the large size of the informal sector and being able to make sure that whatever support is provided can be well targeted toward the informal sector. I mentioned that one of the things that COVID-19 seems to be doing is accelerating processes that began before COVID-19, that were ongoing before. Some of those processes would include, the bringing the informal sector into the formal banking system, of extending digital banking out toward everyone in the informal sector. I know this is big in India already, but just making sure, and I can imagine this will be one of the factors that will accelerate going forward, is just bringing a much wider section of the whole economy into the formal banking system, and thereby being able to provide the financing, the capital that even small enterprises need quite frequently.
Okay, very good. One more question. This is on, when we look at the interest rates in countries, almost real and nominal, you find that about more than 40 countries in the world a month back was having under, negative interest rates. And things are, when the whole thing, sort of green shoots were visible now, including countries like India, which was, on the monetary policy side, which hitherto was cutting the interest rate, now made a pause of it. And in the last few outlook is also seem to be that now the inflation is also coming up as another worry. So how do you see this particular phenomenon of interest rate moving, not only in countries like India, but in the larger scheme of things, when the recovery gets delayed, or the way you projected the recovery to come into full effect by 21 or so?
Yeah, it's going to be a kind of a touchy period over the next year or so for central banks, because they're not going to want to normalize too quickly and put any kind of brakes on this economic recovery. But you don't want to hold rates too low for too long, particularly if interest rates if inflation starts moving up. Frankly, I think what most central banks now are going to do is to simply pause for a couple of reasons. One is there is so much uncertainty in terms of where prices are going. I mentioned amongst our clients, nobody's raising prices, but it does vary country by country. And we know that inflation is higher in India than in a number of other emerging markets. And again, as I mentioned, at the moment, fiscal policy probably is the most effective in terms of quickly getting assistance to particularly the informal sector and small enterprises and such. So my guess is central banks will sit tight, maybe through the end of this year into next year at a minimum, allow the policymakers in government to manage the economy through their fiscal budgets, and we get into next year and we see what happens then. I think that's the most likely outcome, at least in the near term.
Okay, and what is your take on whether the central bankers still have enough ammunition as far as the fiscal and monetary sides are concerned in doing any kind of damage mitigation?
In terms of the central bank coordinating with fiscal policy, is that what you mean? Or yeah, this creates almost a whole nother set of risks that puts at risk the independence of central banks, right? I mean, that's a key factor for effective central bank policy, is to be independent of fiscal policy. And we do see in India, other places, Indonesia in particular, where they're very, very explicitly tied monetary policy and fiscal policy together. And in the US to a certain extent. Short term, I think we're okay. I think what the central banks have to clearly express is how long they may want to take this role and how they will exit from any kind of in a sense, coordinated monetization of fiscal debt. I think short term, given the extraordinary circumstances, the economies can deal with it. It would be good. Longer term, I think investors would start questioning, and there would be impacts on interest rates, on foreign exchange, and such. You would see it expressed through those channels.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And one last question. This is on the market side. How do you see the emerging market? There has been there again a decoupling affect the performance of the fundamentals and the way many of the financial markets was behaving in countries like India wasn't in tune. And I'm sure that you might have noticed similar trends in various other countries of the world, especially the emerging markets. And how do you see this going forward, especially in the financial market part of it, and more specifically including commodity markets like gold and oil and things like that?
Well, some commodities, like oil, for example, are probably most important. I mean, frankly, I don't see oil moving very much over the next year or two, simply because the pace of improvement in the economy will be modest, and there's plenty of supply out there in the oil markets. And so, as demand rises, supply should probably rise along with it, so that if Brent crude, for example, is at $50 a barrel right now, or I think it's something below $50. I haven't checked the last couple of days, but probably doesn't move much from that $50 range going into next year or so. Basically, commodity prices will probably remain fairly stable without a lot of upside pressure, again, until the economy really gets back on its feet next year sometime. I think what the decoupling does do, though, is it creates opportunities going forward. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of competition amongst emerging markets who can compete both in terms of low wages plus sufficient skills and sufficient infrastructure to attract foreign investment and become part of this new supply chains that may emerge around the world. But I don't think it's going to be easy, because there will be a lot of competition. Southeast Asia versus India versus parts of Africa, Mexico, as I mentioned. I mean, everyone's going to be after these potential shifts in foreign direct investment, and policymakers and individuals will have to be very, very sharp and very aggressive in making sure they can provide what firms are looking for.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen, for the wonderful articulation and the way you answered all our queries. And thank you for, I'm sure that all the participants who could tune in, and since we are also on live in the social media, they'll be immensely benefited from your deliberations and also on the insights provided by you. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for this opportunity.
Our invitation is always there for you to visit our campus also whenever time permits. Whenever next time you're here, please come to our campus. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And as far as the participants are concerned, please leave your takeaways and your feedbacks in the chat box. It will be so nice of you, and including if at all you feel that in future we need to take up any such themes, we will be able to do that as well. And hope to see you deliberating, coming forward and participating in more such events in future as well. And it's also opportune time to indicate and tell you that we have another 2 more sessions for the day, wherein on the Atmanirbhar Bharat, our new director of IIM Bangalore, Dr. Rishikesh Krishnan will be deliberating, and another one by an WHO expert as well. That is sometime in the evening at 5:30 to 6:30. So I appreciate if you could tune in for that as well. Thank you.